All right, so we've talked about measuring things in a variety of ways. We've talked about finding our place with coordinate systems, and now if we put those two together, we start to get into surveying or dividing up the land in different ways. And I want to start this unit off by talking about how we're not going to talk about the issues with colonialism. Most of this is about carving up land in the U.S. We're going to talk about systems that are used in the U.S. And I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of issues there with colonialism and indigenous rights. And then I want to talk about the systems that we have rather than focus on the history of the land acquisition and those processes. And the reason I'm doing that is partly one for time and partly two, if you do want to go work with regaining indigenous rights and arguing land ownership and things like that, you have to understand the systems that have been used to divide it up in order to backtrack to what was there previously, and in some ways to understand the intricacies of the systems that were used against the indigenous populations. So that's all I want to say about that. I'm happy to talk about that more in office hours if that's something that interests you, but I want to move on to talking about the actual systems. So the first thing we need is a definition of cadastral maps. And cadastral maps are maps that show land ownership. So anytime you look at a property map and it's showing the boundaries of the property and the ownership of the property, or maybe a reference number to an index that shows the ownership, that's a cadastral map. So we're going to look at a variety of those throughout this series of lectures because we're looking at the systems in which those cadastres were divided. So here's just a quick example in case you've never seen one before. This is from the city of Arcata, not very far from campus. And you can see it shows the streets here, and then because this was done for a particular individual, there isn't much detail beyond that individual's property. But oftentimes you'll see an entire town laid out in this way, or an entire neighborhood with all of the details of property ownership. So we'll come back and look at this one again at the end of the series, but I just wanted you to see one if you've never seen one before. So there are two types of systems that we're going to talk about for dividing up land in the U.S., and that's irregular and regular systems. And the first one I want to talk about, because it's the oldest one used, are the irregular systems. So we'll start off with the English systems, and this predominantly is referred to as meets and bounds. You'll see this in your book as well. And meets and bounds are often measured from odd little landmarks. So a tree or a pile of rocks or a fence post if you're measuring from someone else's property that's already there. It'll often have compass bearings. And you'll often see it in a grant or a purchase of X acres and then surveyed by an individual. So back in the time when this was generally happening, or actually back any time prior to about probably 1920 or so, surveying was taught in high school. So in addition to all of the other fun things that you learned in high school, you learned how to survey a piece of property. So it wasn't really all that strange that people would go out and survey their own boundaries. But as with anything else that's taught in high school, some people are better at it than others. And so some properties were very well surveyed and some properties were very strangely surveyed. And you wind up with a lot of really weird things. So this top diagram here is just an example of one of these meets and bounds. And I'm sure you probably can't read the writing on your screen, but this little corner up here says witness tree. And you can maybe see there's a little tree icon drawn here. And then it says due east 100 rods. So you're traveling due east a distance of 100 rods. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we're going to go due north. And I think that says 20 rods, maybe 30. And then we go 5 degrees north of east, 90 rods. And then we're going to go 45 degrees east of south, X number of rods, etc. So basically you get a direction and a distance, and a direction and a distance, and a direction and a distance, and whatever. And then periodically there will be landmarks along the way. So what happens when you let people go out and survey their own properties, they go out and pick something that's really juicy for them, and you wind up with something that looks like this. This is part of Ross County, Ohio, which is in the southwestern part of the state. And it's in a piece called the Virginia Military Reserve, which was property that was set aside by the U.S. government, the brand new U.S. government, as pensions for soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War because they didn't have any money. Brand new government, no tax base, no money, etc. But they did have land. And again, I know that's questionable, but they just told people, hey, you get X number of acres for your service, go out and carve it up and survey it. And so you wound up with stuff that looked like this. So you have these really weird, chunky little properties. Some people's properties surrounded other properties, which meant, of course, then that you had to get some sort of access road to get to your property. So that was often a tense negotiation with people. And you'll see your discussion for this week, you're going to go look up property dispute or boundary dispute, and sometimes that's part of the dispute is that access road. So we wind up with some really crazy stuff. So here's an example of a property deed that has meets and bounds listed on it. 5 acres in Rhode Island, Providence. And Rhode Island, by the way, if you didn't know this, Rhode Island's actual name is the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. It's the tiniest state with the biggest name. But here's the important part, right? Beginning at a walnut tree marked on 4 sides, being the northwest corner of the lot, and then running east to a stake with a heap of stones around it, and then south to the highway, and then along the highway to a gray oak tree marked on 4 sides, etc. So you can imagine, right, this probably made perfect sense at the time. They're like, hey, there's a stake, we've put some stones around it, made it really obvious. A couple of decades goes by, the ground gets soft, somebody decides they're going to move the stones because they're in the way, or they want to move the property boundary, right? We know the highways sometimes get moved when they redesign them. So you can imagine this is not a particularly precise, fixed property boundary, even though it sounds like it. It sounds like it's very carefully carved out, but stones move, trees get hit by lightning or cut down or whatever. The markings might fade over the years, so it can be exceptionally challenging. Here's another example. Beginning at the mouth of a branch of an ash stump, 20 poles to 2 beech, that would be beech trees, misspelled, 41 poles to a small walnut in Arnett's line, so presumably we know who Arnett is. Then north, 80 poles to a Lynn hickory dogwood, and I have no idea what a hickory dogwood is. 38 poles to an ash, and then 296 poles to Potts line until it intersects with Tully's line, and presumably we know who they are also. Right, so you can see these crazy, crazy little boundaries that go around. We're basically just traveling a distance to a piece. I think in the resources I included a really short video on this process of surveying, and they kind of walk you through how it goes. And you can see how the quality of surveying is a huge factor, but also the nature of the landmarks can be a huge factor. So we've looked at a couple of weird units that I mentioned already, poles and rods being 2 of them. There's a lot of other ones. So if you thought feet and inches were weird, it gets weirder, right? So a pole is 16.5 feet. A pole is often called a rod also. In the Midwest where I'm from, we almost always call them rods. So you have a perch and a pole and a rod, and they're all 16.5 feet, which seems like an awfully peculiar measurement. But again, remember, feet and inches, they're weird too. Then we have links and chains. So in again, where I'm from in Ohio, rods and chains are pretty much the order of the day, but a link is a fragment of a chain such that it's 7.92 inches. Really odd. A chain is 100 links, so that means that a chain is 79.2 inches long. And then we have a couple of variations on a chain, and then we also have a furlong, which is 40 poles or 40 rods. And furlongs are still used in horse racing, but most of the rest of these are just measurements that surveyors need to know because they're working with old property documents that are measured this way. They don't generally get used anymore, but much like NAD 27, we have to use it because it's on the old maps. Okay, so as I mentioned, you get some really weird stuff, and here's some of the examples of some of the property shapes that have come out of this district. And this is the Virginia Military District, which I mentioned. This is a chunk of Ohio because this part of Ohio was originally part of the Virginia colony, and right after the Revolutionary War, it was still the Virginia colony. So we're talking about late 1700s. Ohio didn't become a state until 1803. So this was all still part of Virginia, and then eventually the Northwest Territory. So this little chunk here between a couple of rivers was allowed to be carved up by individuals. And you can see, right, there's some nice big square pieces here. Some people thought squares were nice and tidy, and then there's some weird stuff. And then again, enlarge some of the weird examples. So meets and bounds get you some really weird property lines. And you can often spot this just by looking at county boundaries. So for example, Kentucky, which is just to the south of what we were just looking at, is all meets and bounds. And the county boundaries are very organic. They tend to follow streams or ridge lines or things like that. In Iowa, for example, smack in the middle of the Midwest, flyover states, the county boundaries are very square and rigid, and that's based on one of the regular systems that we're going to talk about later. Okay, so that's the English system. You'll find it all along the eastern coast in what was the original 13 colonies, and remember I said Virginia used to go all the way across. And then a part of Texas is also meets and bounds, which seems like a bit of a jump, but that has to do again with the history of settlement, European settlement in the U.S. And then the rest of these states follow a much more regular system, which we'll get to in a minute, because there's a couple of other weirdos that we want to talk about in the meantime. So next video will be the rest of the irregular systems. See you then.